All right. Well, then why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our Coping with COVID-19 webinar series. Today's discussion is around how adults can manage their anxiety, grief, and challenging home environments during these uncertain times. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists this morning. First is Stuart Jacoby. Stuart is a certified school psychologist and licensed psychologist. He worked for the Boston Public Schools for 12 years and also worked in a variety of community and inpatient settings. Stuart supervised school psychology graduate students and also supported suicide prevention efforts in Boston Public Schools. He maintains a private practice in Sharon, Massachusetts. Welcome, Stuart.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming.
And also on our panel today is Beth Kurland. Beth is a clinical psychologist, author, and public speaker. She has been in practice for 25 years, seeing people across the lifespan to treat a wide array of mental health issues. Beth has a particular interest in mindfulness and mind-body practices for whole person health and well-being. Thanks for being here, Beth.
Thank you so much for doing this, Amy. Really,
Absolutely.
you've put a lot of effort into coordinating this, so thank you.
Of course. A quick disclaimer before we dive into our discussion. The information that our panelists are about to share is strictly for educational purposes and is not in any way intended as psychological counseling or psychological consultation. Due to the sensitivity of this topic, we're keeping all of our panelists anonymous and muted. Our participants anonymous and muted, but we encourage you to ask questions by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Whatever you type will be sent only to myself and our panelists. So let's get started. As everyone is well aware, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty in our lives right now. We're used to being able to plan, predict, and depend on routines that have been totally disrupted without any sense of when we can go back to the way things were. What advice do you both have for people who are struggling right now to make decisions or plans for how to interact with the world around them during these uncertain times?
Okay.
Go ahead, Stu.
Okay. So I think living in an age of uncertainty as we are makes for difficulties for all of us. I think one of the things we're probably all experiencing is, one, a sense of vulnerability about where this is all going, a sense of our routines being disrupted in any number of ways, which can be difficult for any of us. And certainly it's important and difficult as we try to do this and navigate our way through these difficult times to be able to establish routines that support ourselves, support our well-being. What we can do is, try to control what we can. And that is one of the challenges at a time like this. We're living in an age of a pandemic with this general quarantine that we have to be in right now. And it feels for many of us that there's a lack of control. And at a time like this, as I said before, it's important to start to think about what we can control, what we can affect positively in our lives to try and give ourselves a sense of predictability as much as we can.
And interestingly, Amy, because I know when we were talking about this, you were really, we had this discussion around why now? Why are we offering the seminar now? And I think the timing is really important because as things, I don't know, Stu, I'm interested, to see what your experience is, but I'm certainly finding as things are reopening that, I found it actually easier in some ways when it was just so clear that we just had to shelter at home. And now with things reopening, this idea of what's safe to do, what's not safe to do, in the context of so much uncertainty, I'm finding for myself and for many people that I'm hearing from is really experiencing a sense of almost exhaustion just around these decision-making points. And so this question, I think, Amy, that you're kind of raising of how do we guide people or what do we do for ourselves and, trying to help our patients think about, and other people think about decision-making process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, part of what I'm seeing in the people that I interact with, and not just in my practice, but also in my personal life, is that people are making different decisions based on what they feel comfortable with. And everyone's comfort level is a little bit different given certain circumstances. So, for instance, there are people who will feel comfortable going and eating outdoors someplace right now, and won't go into a supermarket. And there are people who will feel comfortable going to a supermarket and won't feel comfortable going and sitting in a restaurant outdoors and dining with a group of people. Um, People feel comfortable having people over their house and social distancing, and other people don't feel ready to do that. And you're right, Beth. It was much more certain when we knew that here are the rules, and now the rules are starting to expand. And
Yeah.
as the rules expand, it really requires of us to really start to think of how do I make decisions at this time and what do I prioritize? And it's not always going to be a sense of pluses and minuses or pros and cons. There's going to be an emotional component to that, that it's important that we acknowledge, because I think it all goes along with a sense of the vulnerability that we feel right now and how we manage that.
Yeah, and I think, so when I think about decision making for myself and, in talking with others, certainly a couple of factors come to mind, but one is the priorities that you mentioned. What is really most essential and important for me? Obviously, there's a basic level of needing food. How do we do that, right? But then there's also that deeper level, as we're all experiencing after these months of social connection, and so really prioritizing and understanding what our values are, and work, so starting from there. That's one place. I think also really importantly is to have a few sources of trusted information as best as we can, um, reliable sources of information that we can go to. And part of the challenge is that it keeps changing all the time. The research is updated and so forth, but where we can then go to these sources and really use that as some kind of a guideline for us in terms of really then, mitigation of risk. How do we, if this is really important to me, what ways can I do this in a way that will, most likely have the lowest risk? So really understanding what is more high risk behavior and what is more low risk behavior, and what is that range in between. And, based on our personalities, we may fall on one end or another of that continuum. Another thing that I think is important is something I read. I found this helpful, actually. This idea of trying to maybe set a reevaluation point every few weeks, because it can become really exhausting. And I'm experiencing myself just personal challenges that we're trying to navigate, just some of these decisions, so that you have kind of certain basic standards that you may follow, at least for a number of weeks, to say, okay, you know what, I am going to wear masks in these circumstances, and I'm going to, social distance this much under these circumstances, and then really being able to maybe reevaluate every couple of weeks, look at, is there any new information? Based on that new information, do I want to modify and change my behaviors in any way? And I think that information really is fluctuating. So it can be helpful to just have some standards and guidelines that we check in on, but also that we kind of are not trying to exhaust ourselves, minutely in every decision.
Yeah, I love your point around, looking at it in a 2 or 3 week chunk, because this isn't a time where we can plan a year in advance or 3 months in advance. And I think we're very much used to thinking long term. And so saying what's going to work for me over the next couple of weeks is a really nice way to make plans without, being overwhelmed with the possibility of change.
One of the things I like to go back to is the idea of having routines and setting up structures for ourselves. I think that's an important piece of this as well. So I think it's important, as I said before, that we stick to a routine, that we sleep and wake up at a reasonable time, that we write a schedule out for ourselves that includes time to getting things done and includes self-care. Setting aside time for things like exercise, setting aside time for socializing with people, making sure that we include all those kinds of things. It's really important to be focusing on the sense of, particularly now when we're trying to make decisions about things in an age of uncertainty, what we are able to control, what we can control of our routines as much as possible, making sure that we set aside times for those things, making sure we eat healthy, making sure we're doing things at predictable times, and maintaining a schedule as much as possible.
That's great. Thank you both. My next question for you two is about anxiety. Many of us have been struggling with anxiety over these last few months. For some, it's on a daily basis. For others, it might ebb and flow. Can you talk about the types of anxiety you're seeing in your practices and some ways that people have successfully managed it?
Yeah. I think we're both seeing a lot of anxiety still. Yeah. Um,
Sure.
yeah. Um, so I think for myself, I would say, I think you really named, Amy, at the beginning, one of the biggest sources of anxiety, being just the uncertainty and really not knowing what things are going to look like, that we're so used to having some predictability. Um, and, the way that I think anxiety shows up is very different for each person, but I can name some of the things that I'm seeing. I think that it can show up as mental rumination, so more of those thoughts that we get looped into in our head. I think I've can show up as difficulty sleeping, just feeling more exhausted, which is something that I'm hearing from a lot of people. Even basic things that, simple things in one's day can feel a lot more effortful. I think physiological anxiety in the body. For many people, there's a heightened feeling of being on edge, or even at times there might be a little bit of panic, or you know uh, that kind of anxiety in the body, just feeling keyed up, um, and or specific panic around going out, and difficulty focusing. I think that's another one that I'm hearing a lot. So just in terms of some of the ways that I've seen anxiety look.
Mhm.
And I think, Stu, you and I have talked about this, that this idea that really helping normalize some of these experiences right now, that so many people are feeling these things, that, if others out there listening right now are experiencing this, that you're not alone. Really emphasizing that. We can talk about
Mhm.
strategies. I don't know, Stu, if you want to sort of add any pieces there before we.
A few things. I think, in addition to what Beth described, it's important that we start to understand what goes on in our bodies to recognize the signs of stress. It's one thing for us to actually list the signs, but it's also important for you to start to become aware on a daily basis of what's going on in your body and what's going on in your thinking. Um, those are important factors that will help us self-diagnose in some ways and be able to say, gee, there's something going on here right now that I need to attend to. I think it's important to remember that when we experience feelings in our body, feelings are actually pieces of information for us. And they're telling us what's going on in our bodies. So we start to feel things like a little more irritability. We start to notice that maybe we're getting a little more rigid in our thinking, or someone points out to us that we're being a little more rigid in our thinking. We start to notice our sleep being off, or our food is being off. We may notice that we're isolating a little bit more. Maybe we're drinking a little bit more, or using other substances. These are all the kinds of responses to stress that let us know that there's something to intervene with here. And so I think that's something that I'm seeing with some of my clients. I've had the unfortunate situation where I've had to hospitalize a couple of people because of their responses to this, because it's been so difficult, and that's hard. Um, I think the isolation is really wearing on people. I can speak for myself. I notice it wearing on me at times. I would like my life to be much bigger. Um, and I feel the irritability that goes along with that at times. I want to be able to go out like everyone else does. And I also have to be mindful of the fact that there's something larger going on here that I have to take into account. And going back to what we talked about before, about making decisions about how I deal with this. Um, so I know we'll go on. We'll talk a little bit about ways to deal with the stress. But those
Yeah.
are some of the things that I've been noticing also with people.
Yeah, let's talk about some strategies. Beth, do you want to start? And then Stu?
I wanted to comment on Stu, I think you laid out two important piece is, this idea of what's happening in our bodies and what's happening in our minds. And so one of the ways when I think about strategies, we can really work with both of those. We can work with the worries in our minds, and we can also work physiologically with that anxiety energy, that stress energy in our bodies. And so in terms of strategies for, for mental rumination, for worry that I think we all have. So again, certainly normal to be experiencing this. But I think, so a couple of things. One thing I think is really helpful is to ask ourselves, what is in our sphere of influence? And Stu, you also touched upon this earlier. And sometimes I like to think about two boxes, a present moment box and a future box. And imagining that we could, and maybe even writing it out, what's in our present moment box? What is actually happening right now? Today, maybe this week, but what's here now in our lives? And then the future box being, all of those what ifs. What if this happens, and what if that, and what if schools are this, or what if, my job, but things that have not yet occurred. And really, if we imagine dumping out the contents of both of those boxes in the middle of the room, it's going to be very overwhelming. But if we kind of take that future box and gently put the lid on it and sort of set it aside and really go back to what is in my present moment box, and then how can I take actions? What is it that I can do today, working with what is in that box? And maybe there is some planning for the future in there. Maybe there's just making choices today, that can help make my day, bring some well-being into the day. So coming back to the present moment, and really trying to notice when our minds start running away into that future. It takes a lot of work. It's practice. It's not easy, but I think when we can recognize, part of the big piece is not recognizing that we're off in that future place, and we can get caught in that. And so recognizing that is, something our mind is mentally constructing, and what's here now. So I would say, that is one piece. I think also something really helpful in the face of uncertainty is to ask, what can I choose? Instead of what can I control, which we can also ask, and I think that's important too, but what can I choose? So when we ask that question, it kind of shifts to our deepest values. I can choose compassion today. I can choose kindness. I can choose self-care. I can choose, something that is of importance to me, and act from that place. And that can give us some sense of efficacy in a really, in the face of uncertainty. And then I'm happy to share, some strategies for physiologically, but Stu, want to kind of pause too and let you jump in. Love to hear how you work
The
with
other thing, think about is also being reasonable in what we expect of ourselves. At a time like this, our activities are more limited. What we can do and accomplish is more limited. And I think we do have to ask the question of, what can I do on any given day, at any given moment, that's good for taking care of myself? What are my expectations, and how do I start to adjust those at this time? And also to give ourselves permission to have off days. I think that's really important. We're not going to be on top of things every day with everything that's going on right now. And it's probably not reasonable to expect that we're always going to be at the top of our games. And going along with what you were talking about, Beth, around having compassion, it's having compassion for ourselves around that, and understanding that, gee, you know what? I'm going to be a little off sometimes. That's not the worst thing in the world right now. And I can account for that on any given day and adjust my activities and my routines and do some things to take care of myself. So I think that's another message that I'd like people to take to heart at this point as well.
I
I
love that.
also see there's some comments popping up from here and there in the chat box.
Yeah, one question is around something that you just touched upon, Stu, which is how can people manage these demands in their lives that are really important or high stakes when we just can't be at the top of our game?
So, again, that's a hard one, because it's going to be different for each of us. I think, again, it's understanding where we are, and in some ways, taking a temperature of ourselves each day, an emotional temperature and a physical temperature, checking in with our bodies, checking in with our breath, and seeing what that's telling us about how we are. understanding what our energy level might be on any given day, and responding to that accordingly. One of the things I often suggest that people do is to do a body check, just a very simple scan through the body from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, and just noticing what's going on in each part of your body at any given time. And noticing, where the sources of tension may be within your body can be very helpful in doing a little bit of a self-diagnostic or taking your own, you know, quote unquote physical temperature on any given day.
I also think that we're all struggling. And so no one is 100% successful right now. And so that baseline level where we used to be here, it's okay to be here because everyone else is here with us.
Hmm.
I think that's so important. Yeah, I love that point. And I find that, in my work that's really coming up a lot of just reassuring people that it's okay to not be, and it's understandable to just not be able to be at the top of one's game all the time, or to, that the standards, to not use our old template to measure our current behaviors, that we
Mhm.
really need to shift our template a little bit, to
Yeah.
understand how we are.
And I think what goes along with that is giving ourselves permission to be off a little bit, to not be at the top of our game. And it may be that, there may be some days that we binge watch television because that's what's going to take care of us, that we don't have the mental energy. And that's all right to do. We don't have to always be accomplishing something. Sometimes taking care of yourself and decreasing the demands may be what needs to be accomplished on a given day. And to understand that and not feel like I have to do everything that's on my to-do list. That maybe today is a day where I don't get to everything. And to say to yourself and give yourself the message, it's all right today. I don't have to be perfect today. I can be the best I can and take care of myself to the best of my ability. And also to understand that that applies to other people as well.
Mhm.
And I would sort of just add to that. There's something that often I sometimes call it the undistraction technique, because people will often say to me, "Well, I was all sort of worried and keyed up, and so I distracted myself by cooking, or I distracted myself by." Going for a walk or whatever. And I try to flip that for them and say, what's happening here is the distraction, the mental rumination and the worry and the spiraling. And so when we can step into our lives, when we can engage with our five senses in what's happening right now, so it might be cooking a meal, or going for a walk, or drawing, or listening to a piece of music,
Mm.
those kinds of things that actually engage our senses, step us out of that part of our brain that can get caught up in the worry and anxiety, and can sometimes just bring a little sense of ease. And I really like to think about just little moments. So we're not striving for some big spectacular day, where we're just totally at ease and on top of our game. But can we have maybe just little moments of ease or well-being in our day? And how do we find ways of doing that, even very small steps at a time?
Right.
uh,
So there's one more question.
One thing that Beth said before we move on.
Yeah.
I just want to really emphasize what one of the things Beth was saying is that the sources of our stress in our lives are not only external, they come from our thinking as well and how we interpret the events in our lives. And I think that's just something really important to us, which makes our ability to have, uh, we call sometimes good mental hygiene is important, and keeping track of when our thinking starts to get the best of us and when we're producing that anxiety in our lives and be able to respond accordingly.
Absolutely. There's one more question from our attendees that I wanted to ask you both before we move on to another topic. It's around, how do we talk to our bosses or supervisors when we're not feeling like we're at the top of our games? Should we be saying anything or at all? Or does it, I'm assuming it depends.
Go ahead.
Both of us look like we want to answer. Beth, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it is probably a personal, I don't think either of us can speak obviously to any um, person-specific situation. Um, Gosh, I mean, I guess the thing that came up for me around this is really just, and I know this is not directly answering the question, but how do we take care of ourselves in the context of all these external demands? So so really, I guess first and foremost, making sure that one is doing what they can to be getting support, you know, around these challenges. But I guess I would say it really depends on one's circumstances. I've had experiences where some businesses, some organizations are doing a really great job with mental health issues and stress and understanding the impact of this on everybody, and that where I'm finding and hearing from others that bosses are really being supportive and you know, and that's really refreshing to hear that. I can imagine there might be other circumstances for sure where, that may not be the case. And then, it becomes sort of knowing your own circumstance, I guess, and what it is that, you know, um, you need to maintain, your own well-being. Um, yeah, I'm not sure, Stu, if you have.
Yeah, a couple of things I would just add to that. Um, I don't deal with my own boss anymore. I am my own boss at this point. So if I want to call in sick, I call in sick to myself. But I think it's also looking at within the structure of your individual day is what is reasonable for you to accomplish. And can you alter some things within the context of your job around getting things done? Because we are off in many ways. Many of us are dealing, as anticipating another question, we're dealing with things like grief. Um, we're dealing with loss. And that may throw us off sometimes. And again, I think it goes back to being reasonable with each of us, what we can do to accomplish things on each day, and what is reasonable to accomplish and what's not reasonable to accomplish, and adjusting your expectations. And maybe you don't tell your boss if you feel like you don't have that kind of relationship, but no, you just do the best you can in getting through the day and taking care of yourself.
Thank
And
you.
if there are other resources, that you can reach out to for support to do that.
Great, thank you. I want to switch gears and talk about grief for a few minutes. At this point, most of us have heard about someone, if not know someone personally, who has died during this pandemic. And many of us are grieving right now. With all of the limitations placed on our rituals, our traditions, our ability to be physically together, can you both talk about how mourners can process their grief during these difficult times?
I like to start with that one, only because of my own personal situation. My brother passed away from the virus pretty early on, and it was a time where my ability to bury my brother, have a Shiva service, and have a normal grief process was really interrupted. And we often feel like we need the structures of grief, particularly in Judaism. That there are prescribed ways of grieving within Judaism. We do a burial. We have a shiva. We follow. We say Kaddish each day in a group of people, and community is very, very important. And for many of us who've lost people at this time, that's been a challenge to be able to follow those types of grief. I know I've spoken about this with a lot of different people who've experienced similar kinds of things, and it's important to reach out as best as you can to the supports you have in your life. Um, I know when I buried my brother, my wife and I were the only people who could go graveside. And I had to deal with relatives around that. So being able to set limits sometimes is important in dealing with that. Being able to respect the fact that you're in pain is also very, very important. And taking care of yourself in that time of grief, and following what structures you can. I think we've seen within our temple community a variety of ways that people have dealt with grief. People have had Zoom shivas, which I know some people find very supportive. I chose not to do that. I wanted people just to come to services and express their support that way. It's always going to be an individual choice of how we deal with that. But what's important is that when you're going through grief is to recognize that you are in pain and that needs to get attended to. Um, the world is going to be full of reminders about your loved one, and to notice that. And one of the things I know that got disrupted for me was that I spoke to my brother every morning, and I want to go pick up the phone or wait for his phone call, and that wasn't happening anymore. That's a pretty common experience, and to be able to talk with somebody about that and notice that that's a change. Um, Take a moment just to catch up. Beth, I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
pick up on that and some other things.
Thank you for sharing that, Stu. Um, I mean, I'm not sure I have a whole lot new to add. I think um, the piece that really comes to mind for me to emphasize is just that importance of um, social support and self-care, and the fact that people grieve differently. People's needs during their time of grief are different. And so to the extent that one is able to um, try to attend to what is it, that may be most helpful for them given the parameters we're living in, at any given time. But I think certainly finding some sources of social support and social connection um, during one's times of grief is extremely important. And I guess, I would just really say, um, for anybody who may be struggling or know people who are struggling, to not hesitate to reach out to mental health professionals. It's actually, I think, easier than before in some ways that the telehealth is available, so people don't even have to leave their homes. Um, and, and just recognizing that that is an additional source of support for people out there that is accessible and may be, really supportive especially during a time like this.
I think the thing I want to really add to that is that people, as you said, Beth, people grieve differently. We all have different styles of grief. Some people grieve outwardly and utilize, certain kinds of structures. Some people grieve very, very privately. And I think it's important for those of you who may know somebody who's grieving to respect the style of grieving that your friend or partner chooses and not expect them to grieve in the way that you think is the right way. My wife is smiling at me as I'm answering that question right now because, you know, a person may want to say Kaddish every day, or a person may not want to say Kaddish every day. So I think it's things like that are important. Don't judge people who have decided to structure the grief in a certain way. You may feel shut out sometimes because people who are grieving made choices for a while. Don't take it personally if you weren't able to go to the funeral of a loved one because the family had to make a choice about that. It's all part of the constraints that we're experiencing right now. And it changes from time to time. And it's part of what's difficult about this time right now.
And Stu, I think something helpful that you shared with me when we talked a couple of months ago about this topic was that your stress is all intertwined right now. Your grief over a loss over someone, and then your grief over the pandemic, they're kind of intermixed and they're affecting each other. And so it's really hard to parse out sometimes, am I stressed right now because of this? Am I stressed right now because of this? And I think that being aware of that can be really helpful when grief becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because we are grieving on multiple levels right now. We're grieving a way of life right now that we've experienced. We're grieving um, a sense of the loss of control or loss of activity that we would normally engage in. We're grieving loss of our structures. Um, and it is right, you're right, it's all very much intertwined with each other. And it's important to recognize that and understand that you're not going through it by yourself,
Mhm.
that you're going through it with a lot of people right now, because this is something that's community and it's global at this
Yeah.
point.
And I think one of the things that the research really um, shows us is that when we're able to name and acknowledge what we're feeling, it can help to dial down the intensity of whatever we're experiencing.
Mhm.
It doesn't make it go away. It's not supposed to make it go away, but it can help us cope with that. So so having ways of naming and acknowledging what we're feeling, whether just to ourselves or talking about it with others, can be really helpful.
Mhm.
Thank
I
you.
think the takeaway from that is we're all in this together right now. And
Yeah.
it's important to remember that we're not alone with that. And no, we're not alone with our grief. We're grieving in a community that may look and feel a little different right now. And we're still grieving within the community. And again, I want to just encourage you to reach out as you need to. For those of us in the temple community, the rabbi's been wonderful with these kinds of things. I know there's many people who've reached out to him during this time. And, that's been very, very important.
Thank you. I have two more questions for you both. I really have been loving the questions from the attendees. So if anyone has anything else, continue to write in the chat. My last two questions for the two of you are really around the challenges we're all facing in our home environments. So the first one, a number of people are struggling with social isolation right now, especially people who are living alone. Um, can you share about social isolation and how that can impact our lives and ways that we can all respond to feelings of loneliness? I think none of us are immune to that, even those who are living with 5+ people in their homes.
Yeah, I think the lack of social connection as we know it is just enormously challenging for everybody. So whether people are living alone and that intense social isolation is so difficult, or whether we're living in homes but still not able to see our friends or family in the manner that we're used to. Um, it's immensely challenging. So I think a couple of things that come to mind for me are just really trying to continue, and it really is maybe continuing to evolve as far as finding healthy sources of social connection, and really notice, paying attention to what each of us need. That some of us may need more of that than others, and it may look different, but how do we do that in creative ways also that even can kind of keep it fresh and interesting? And when I say that, I think that people are experiencing Zoom fatigue on multiple levels. But I've heard creative things like people doing Zoom cooking classes. I'm part of a women's group. We meet every other week, and we have been asking, some kind of a question. We put out a question for all of us to answer, which sort of gets us just to think about things in a different way. And that's kind of a fun way to stay connected without necessarily just sitting around and talking. People feel like, I hear it's Groundhog Day. One day is the same as the next. And to just sit around and be talking about the pandemic can be, I think, draining, and maybe important at times too. But to have some fun and creative ways of staying connected, or and then the other piece that I think about is, how do we fill our buckets, and to kind of identify what are the buckets that are most important. That each of us has these, I'm calling buckets, that nourish us and nurture us, and they might look different for each person. Some examples might be things that are nourishing or inspirational. Maybe it's podcasts or meditation or prayer or tending to a garden or cooking a healthy meal. Things that give us meaning. Maybe it's helping others, reaching out, giving back in some way. Certainly the connection that I talked about, learning something new, finding a sense of satisfaction, maybe through projects, completing small tasks, and then self-care kinds of things. And how do we fill each of those buckets? Not all the time and not every day, but maybe choosing one bucket and finding one activity in a given day to help fill that. Because I think as we connect in with feelings of meaning, and things that inspire us, that can help us through the loneliness, that can help us through some of these challenges.
I think going along with that, and I think it's something that's been changing over time, has been dealing with those of us who may have parents or older relatives who are in isolation right now, and how do we support them? no, one of the things we saw at the beginning of this period of social isolation is that people were locked down in facilities, and so people could not go and visit their relatives in the same way they could. Now that's starting to open up. Again, we don't know what the future will hold. So, being able to visit people in a way that respects social distance and maintains safety is very, very important, and making those kinds of social connections. But also remembering that people are going to have different comfort levels with this in trying to achieve social connectedness. So you may want to have visit with people somewhere, and they don't feel comfortable with that. Maybe they don't want to take a walk with you because they're nervous about that, or you become aware that they haven't been practicing social distancing in the way that you would feel comfortable with, and you don't want to expose yourself because you may be feeling vulnerable right now. It's important to respect that and take action that's appropriate for that. I think the other thing, Beth, that you talked about was finding creative ways to engage with other people online, not just talking about our feelings, our emotions, and current events, but doing things like having dinner with friends and just chatting, or playing games with each other online. I know that the people are floating the idea the sisterhood of having virtual mahjong right now, and trying to find ways to do that, because activity helps you relate in a different kind of way, and that's important. So to think about things like that. I think the other part of the social isolation is, as we're in our homes, with people, we're with family all the time, and there are changes in routines with that. um, so just to understand that, and is that going to the next question? I don't remember. So
Yeah, before we jump into that, there's another.
I don't want to go into that yet, but it was just popping into my mind. So
Yeah. So I just want to be mindful of the time. It's almost 11:45. We do have two more questions. So for those of you who would like to stay on and listen, please do. If you need to jump, that's totally fine. We are recording this so you can listen at another time. A question from one of our attendees is around touch. And for those who might be living alone, for instance, is there a consequence of not having human touch? And if so, how can we mitigate that?
So I can jump in around that. And I don't know, Stu, if you might have anything to add, but a couple thoughts come to mind. I don't think there's any research that I'm aware of, then there may be actually, but just because pandemic is unfolding, um, certainly we know, for infants, the importance of touch, and just, I think for all of us, we know internally how important that can be, and that it's really hard to not have that. I think in terms of mitigating that, just a couple of simple things. But one is, there's a particular gesture, which is hand on the heart, hand on the belly. And just to do this for ourselves, and even those who are listening can sort of experiment for a moment, if they want, while I'm talking. But there is something about this posture and just gentle pressure on our own body that has actually been shown to calm the nervous system. So touch has direct effect on our nervous system, on calming our nervous system. And so even just, our own touch in this way, and then taking a couple of deep breaths and really slowing down the exhalation, can turn on that part of our brain that helps kind of send soothing messages in a similar way as we might experience if we were, experiencing touch from another. And the other thing that comes to mind is research and practices around using our imagination to experience comfort from another. And so there are practices from the wisdom traditions, but also, research that shows that when we call something up in our imagination, it brings about physiological changes. So to take a moment and really call up a moment of care from another person, and think about that time, and make that real in one's mind, or to envision oneself being encircled by their own caring committee, people who love and care about them, even if they're not present or able to, touch or hug them. But just calling that to mind and really focusing the mind on that, even, for a minute or two or more, can, again, help to regulate the nervous system, can help to send soothing messages, calming messages that can be helpful.
Okay. A few things I would add to that. I think, there is a lot of research around sensory issues and sensory deprivation issues and how it impacts the human body. So doing things like hugging. So just, doing a self hug can be really, really nice if you're not able to get hugs from other people. Um, Doing things like hugging a pillow can be really, really nice. And just to sit there and just take some deep breaths with that and just experience, the pressure on your body. Because one of the things that we know from the research, that the proprioceptive system, responds to touch and to gentle pressure. And it's like swaddling an infant in some ways. And, giving that sense of safety and containment can be really helpful. Um, so things of that nature can be really good, or wrapping yourself in a blanket also, and just, feeling the blanket and enclosing you can also be very, very helpful. I really want to thank you for that question because I think it's really, really important. And it's something we often forget to talk about. So again, thank you.
Thank you both for answering it. Um, the last question is still around the challenges we're all facing at home. So those of us who, are not socially isolated in our home environments, but who are in fact around their families 24/7. And the lack of space that they might be experiencing from one another can be pretty overwhelming. What are some tips for creating healthy amounts of space for ourselves when families are cooped up together?
So I think to give us a quick answer is to remember not to take things too seriously in this area. Um, we're many of us are at home with our spouses full time right now. We're both maybe working from home, and or you have your family at home if you have children living with you as well. And we may not necessarily be used to the routines if we were out at work before, and people were having these daily routines that took them out of the house. Now we're trying to affect our daily routines within the confines of our houses. You may find that they're sticking to your spouse, or children are sticking to themselves a little bit more in a room. And don't jump to conclusions around that. One of the things that's important for us to realize is that each of us has a different need for social contact, has needs for personal time and personal space. And they just may need time for themselves, which may become more apparent to you when you're alone together so much than you normally are. So just to recognize that and negotiate it and understand that. I know Amy and I have talked about it, that, sometimes, one's need for a certain kind of structure conflicts with your partner's need for a certain kind of structure or a certain type of thing. So it's important to really talk about that and understand that, and account for that within your relationships at home.
And I would just kind of piggyback on that to say, highlighting a few things. One is that I think we tend to assume whatever our needs are, that maybe the other person, has similar needs. So I think really being able to and I think everybody falls on a continuum in terms of a need for alone time versus need for social time. And so really being able to recognize first and foremost, what is my need, and then being, that really importance of communication, and whether it's maybe even setting a regular time to sort of have a weekly family check-in, or to sit down together and kind of talk about, what are your needs, right now, for where are you at in terms of your need for alone time versus connection, and how can we do both? How can we, let's see if we can find some ways to connect together, but also, what would be important for you to take some time alone. And so really being able to communicate, and then really deeply listen to the other person to understand what their needs are, I think can go a long way in terms of then navigating with greater ease around that. And not
Remember,
to say that it's easy by any means, but yeah, I think it
it
is.
is, but it takes communicating. And remember, we're all on a continuum, and the continuum of what we call normal is really wide. And so what may seem unusual to you is very usual to somebody else. And it's important to recognize that and negotiate accordingly with your spouse, your family, whomever, to be able to help get your needs met as much as possible, with as much ease as possible. And again, adjust your expectations. I think that's the other thing I want to underscore is, really do an expectations check from time to time and seeing if you're being reasonable in your expectations of your partner and your family.
Mhm. Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here this morning. And thank you all for attending. That's all that we have planned for today. You can check back at our Temple website later this week for a recording of this webinar, which you can send to anyone who you think might benefit from this discussion.
Can I just highlight one of the comments that one of the people made before we go? Is obviously we're following questions. Someone brought up the fact that she has pets, and I just really want to underscore how important pets are. If you have them, pets are great companions in many ways. Pets also can meet some of our sensory needs, and I really want to emphasize that. So thank you for that comment to the person who made it. I think that's very, very important.
Absolutely.
And I just want to again thank you, Amy, so much for you really kind of coordinated all this and put a lot of time and energy behind the scenes. So thank you so much, and also really appreciate everybody who's joining us today too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you
you.
again for all
Take
of you
care.
who've allowed us to be here with you today and answer your questions. I hope we've met your needs.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.